Good evening from Boston College. I'm Bert Howell, and I'm the Executive Director of Intersections. I welcome you to the Show at 6, BC and the Common Good. The Show at 6 features friends and members of the BC community discussing a range of issues affecting our world today, all revolving around the theme of the common good. Topics include how the BC community is responding to the effects of COVID-19, to the enduring challenges of the marginalized, to our own resiliency and solidarity, and to the upbuilding of human dignity throughout the world. The show is based on the central insight of the common good. That is, that the resources that humanity has and needs must be shared equitably. For instance, today each of us is called to promote the common good by social distancing, by wearing masks, and by washing our hands. These practices, like other forms of solidarity, are not only for our own good, but for the common good. In many of the previous segments, we've heard repeatedly about the disparities in healthcare, employment, and education that lead African Americans to be much more at risk to this pandemic. At the same time, the brutal killings of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, and George Floyd highlight all the more how white privilege, anti-Blackness, and other forms of racism endanger the lives of our brothers and sisters. We are, at BC, a Jesuit Catholic school committed to being men and women for others. We know that through solidarity and a commitment to the common good, we can beat the virus of COVID-19. But we must be no less committed to defeating the virus of racism that destroys the lives of so many. At 6:40, my co-host and I will ask our guests questions from the audience. Members of the audience can pose a question before 6:40 p.m. via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Let me repeat that. Members of the audience can pose a question before 6:40 p.m. via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Please identify yourself by your name and relationship to BC. I'm delighted to co-host this segment this evening with Mary Troxell. She is an associate professor of the practice in the philosophy department. She has taught in the Pulse program for 15 years, as well as in the Perspectives and Capstone programs. Mary?
Yes, I have the pleasure and the honor of introducing our guest today. Megan T. Sweeney is an associate professor of the practice in the theology department at Boston College. She's taught in the Pulse program for service learning since 2006 and has served as the inaugural Cooney Family Director of Pulse since 2014. Shanteri Baliga is the Assistant Director at the Pulse program for service learning. Prior to working for Boston College, she worked at Project Bread's Food Source Hotline for 15 years, working with and supervising Pulse students. Nimsu Ng is a member of the class of 2022 in Boston College's Morrissey College of Arts and Sciences, majoring in economics and minoring in accounting for finance and consulting and in philosophy. Nimsu was a student in the Pulse program, and she currently serves as a Pulse Council member. And finally, Justin Schneblin is a rising senior in the Morrissey College of Arts and Sciences, studying English and philosophy. Justin was a student in the Pulse program and currently serves as a Pulse Council member as well. So to kick us off, I thought I would ask a question about your Pulse origin story, so to speak. So I'd like to hear first from Megan and then Shanteri about what got you into this work.
Thanks, Mary. Thank you, Bert. And thanks to the Show at 6 for featuring the Pulse program as we just completed our 50th anniversary year. When I was applying for jobs at finishing my theology program, my PhD, I kept coming across the Pulse job description, and I kept coming back to it, and I kept coming back to it, and I found myself more and more drawn to it. And that's in part because not only did it blend my own interests in theology and philosophy, but it also brought together my own interests in social justice and my own sort of campus ministry work that I had done with students when I was a PhD student. So for me, it brought together, it was this perfect blending of the things that I'm most interested in. So that's what brought me to Pulse.
I'd like to echo Megan's thanks to everyone for allowing us to have this moment of celebration of Pulse. So I had sort of a kind of a strange journey toward Pulse, I would say. I was finishing up the last year of my graduate school. I was at UMass Boston finishing a master's in mental health education, and I knew that I would have a hard time finding a job because I was an international student. So I actually looked for a job for a year in the days when you looked in the paper for a job, not online. And I applied to Project Bread at that time for a different position, and I was called in to interview as a counselor on the Food Source Hotline. And I fell in love with the work, and I stayed for 15 years. And during that time, I fell in love with the Pulse program without actually knowing that I was falling in love with the program. And when the opportunity came, while it was really hard for me to leave this position, being on the Food Source Hotline, I felt like I went from one home to another home. So working with something that has a mission has been really important to me. And so instead of being able to work with one mission, I now can work with 50 plus missions, which is really exciting.
All right. I would love to hear from Justin and then Nimsu about what made you apply for the Pulse Council.
Yeah, so I took Pulse my first and second years at Boston College. When I was a freshman, I applied in the lottery, and both Nimsu and I did this, and we got lucky, and we got into the program. And after my first year, I think wanted to cling as long as I could to the Pulse program. So in one respect, I applied out of that to be on council, and the second was that I really did want to see under the hood, so to speak, of nonprofits in Boston, and it's been a joy to be able to do that on council.
Yeah, like Justin mentioned, I was lucky enough to be selected from the Pulse Lottery as a first-year student, being able to participate in the class. And I think something that Pulse really emphasizes in its students is that there are a lot of lifelong questions that we are kind of first introduced to and that we're continuing to talk about. And I guess I just wasn't done answering those questions with 1 year in Pulse, and really wanted to join the community that was fostered throughout, and I've loved my experience on council ever since.
Megan, I have a question for you. You mentioned the long history of Pulse, 50 years. And I would have to say 50 much celebrated years for very good reason. But sometimes Pulse is praised, I think, without really understanding much about it. Could you start with the fundamentals? What is the Pulse program, and how do you consider its purpose for BC students, for BC, and for the larger community?
Pulse is an academic service learning program that is based in the theology and philosophy departments at Boston College. The Pulse core course, which is the course that we're probably best known for, satisfies the 6 credits of philosophy and 6 credits of theology that students need to complete in order to graduate. So typically students are in class for 4 hours per week, 3 hours of lecture, 1 hour of discussion, and then they are doing their various service hours at one of maybe 55-ish community partners around the city of Boston, serving in a variety of capacities. Could be school tutoring, it could be like Shanteri's former employment on the Project Bread Food Source Hotline. So what the class is trying to do, what the core class is trying to do, is introduce or interrogate questions of personhood, what it means to be a responsible human being, the question of driving this particular series, what is the common good, and how individual students can better understand how they become human beings or become persons through their care and responsibility for others. So the course is properly called Person and Social Responsibility, and built into that course is, I think, the assertion that we become human beings through our care and concern for the world and for the concerns of the world. So the students are interrogating basic texts in philosophy and theology, and using the intersection of the course text, the class texts, and their service experiences to really explore not only these abstract questions that are actually really, really important questions, but also the reflective turn in Pulse. We really try to give students an opportunity to look at themselves and sort of how what they're learning out there has an impact on what's happening inside their own lives. So it's intellectual formation, it's emotional formation, it's a kind of self-discernment process. So as a core course, it hits a lot of points for students, and I think it can be over the course of a year, can be a really wonderful opportunity for students. We also offer a few 3-credit 1 semester elective courses. Justin took one of those when he said he took Pulse his sophomore year or his second year rather, that was one of the courses. And then for students on the council, we also offer some council-only seminars, which are, we enjoy those very much. So that's just sort of the basic structure. Yeah.
I have a question for Justin, and this has to do with something I hear from my students a lot, which is that Pulse is a very challenging course, and it's difficult, and it challenges students in ways that go beyond simply the academic rigor of the course. And so what I'd like to hear from you about is, how have you found the course challenging? How has it challenged you?
I think the challenge of Pulse didn't end when I finished the core my freshman year, or even in the one semester that I took the elective. I think the question is really pervasive. The questions that it asks is pervasive every day in my life. But before Pulse, I think for a lot of students, this is a common experience, but I did service in high school, right? But for me, I was doing service just to knock out hours. I was more concerned with baseball, all of the high school experience and all that meant. But on a different, maybe, higher level, I think there was, especially for my situation in my life, in the background that I come from, a real void, I think, between myself and the external situations and reality of the world. And in that void, there's that void is never empty, right? I think there's misunderstanding, superstitions, and real apathy about others' lives and situations. And so there's can be a real opportunity to cocoon yourself, I think, and in one's own experience. And so I don't think going into BC that I really identified at all with the lives or even the pain or joys of others. But Pulse definitely brought me close to others, brought me proximate, and really sensitized me in my service. I served at a residence for kids who have experienced trauma, and just the joy and the pain and the hope that all that I experienced there was incredible. And it was a feeling of aliveness that I had never felt, really. But more than that, I think it was a decentering almost, where I wasn't at the center of my life, and I really found myself challenged by that I found my identity now really in people outside of me and in communities outside of me. And I identified a lot of myself with kids out of foster care home in Boston. And I could have never imagined that. And that changed my heart, changed the way I moved through life, and changed me spiritually, but it also changed me politically and morally too. And so I couldn't think the same way about issues, and I couldn't go about with the same framework that I looked at the world before Pulse. And that was very challenging.
Thank you for that, Justin. I think it really reminds me how, and as mentioned before, that the theme of this show at 6 is the common good, and trying to make contributions to this. And Shantari, I have a question for you about the common good. Now, when we started doing this summer, this program, the show at 6, actually came out of a conversation at the Jesuit Institute, where we were called by Jim Keenan to think about and to respond to this theme of the common good. And I think this is a real specialty of Pulse, as we've been hearing. So could you talk to me about how Pulse has a special role to play in light of the current challenges, both COVID and the struggle for racial justice?
So there's the classroom component of Pulse, and then there's the service component of Pulse, and they really cannot be taken apart. But both of those act as a lens that sharpens, that allows you to focus. And, much like when you put glasses on, for you to be able to see clearly, both of those have to be working at the same time. You need an optometrist in a way to Just, okay, so what is it like when you do this? Okay, what about this? It's okay, but then you see it, then it's sharp. And that's really what Pulse, the classroom and the service is doing together. And in the struggles with COVID-19 and with racism and racial justice, it is simply impossible not to see that. And students are seeing that, you know, in some way. Many of our students, as well as, you know, youth, you know, have a lot on their mind. They're thinking about the future, what are they going to do next, things like that. But Pulse allows this focus, and it also allows you to continue to stay focused on looking at COVID and looking at racism and many of the structural injustices that, you know, in many cases have very common roots. I would also be remiss in saying that the pandemic has made Pulse in a way function differently, because with social distancing, we've really had to think also about how can the classroom and service still have that sharp focus when we can't be with one another, where we can't be proximate. And that has meant thinking, you know, in different ways while still maintaining that core of community and relationships and being proximate to one another in now. Social injustice is not going away. You know, it's not wearing a mask, it's there. The divides are deepening, poverty still exists, there's still hunger, people are still going to be unhoused and unsheltered. So the work will still continue even when we can't be proximate with one another. And so that is where Pulse can still continue the work. And it also means that students have to be willing to wear those glasses too, to be able to see through. Because sometimes seeing things sharply it can mess with your depth perception a little bit. So we want students to be able to want to put those glasses on and be focused.
I'd like to hear from Nim Soo about what your experience was in the classroom. And I think this is another thing I hear from Pulse students a lot, that their Pulse class is unlike a lot of other classes, not necessarily better or worse, but just distinctive. So how would you consider the classroom as distinctive in Pulse?
Yeah, I think the classroom experience is something that is very unique to the program and that provides a lot of opportunities for students not only to engage with the material, the philosophy and theology texts that they're reading, but in the conversations that they're having with each other and with their experiences at service. In particular, Pulse students are with each other for the entire year. So beginning from September all the way to when classes end in May. And I think that provides a great opportunity for students to really learn from each other and grow with each other and be able to have a lot of conversations in a very natural manner that might not be as opportunistic in other classes. In particular, too, students will meet usually 2 to 3 times a week, and then have a discussion section as well. And so with that discussion section, you're really able to take the experiences that you're having outside of the classroom, where you're seeing what you're learning applied it to the real world, and be able to come back and talk to your classmates about what you're feeling, how they're feeling, and then being able to, I guess, take from the energy from each other and just learn more about it. I think for me in particular, one memory comes to mind. I believe it was the last day of classes. So it was a very last day of classes in my first year at BC. And unfortunately, a racial injustice event had happened the night before. And I recall my Pulse professor, although she had an agenda that day, dropped the agenda and said, let's talk about this. This is an issue that needs attention right now. It can't wait. And we want it to open as a forum of conversation. And just seeing the way that pedagogy and that structure was able to so fluidly mold around what was happening in front of us in real life and be able to take from our experiences and talk about it. I think it provided a very unique sense of community and openness that I really didn't find in a lot of my other classes. I think in particular too, it's important to know, at least from my personal experience, Pulse isn't necessarily there to be a solution to all things social injustice. It's not there to fix everything. Rather, it's really to provide a space and a community for students to look at the type of questions that we're posing to the world and have a lifelong discussion about it, and really being able to be at the start of that journey with each other.
Nim Soo, when I listen to you talk about the classroom, it really reminds me how formative Pulse is. And Megan, you used that word in describing this particular program. And when I think of formation, I think of many different qualities, but two of them are intensity and something that's unforgettable. And those seem to me, hearing what Justin and Nimsu have said, seem really important to Pulse. We also know, or you've told me in the past, that the influence of Pulse goes beyond graduation. So what do you see as the impact of Pulse on students in the long term?
John Terry used the metaphor of glasses. So I'm going to say, I think that long-term impact is a kind of paradigm shift for students. I remember one student saying he couldn't unsee things after the year was over. And so our hope and our goal is that students will pursue whatever vocation they want to, whatever career they're called to, whatever family structure they want, but that they will remember what they've learned and what they've experienced in their year in Pulse and bring it with them into whatever careers they choose and whatever family structures they choose for themselves. So the world needs lawyers and accountants who have a care and concern for those who are suffering and experiencing various forms of oppression. So the goal is not to create a cookie cutter of student by the end of the year. The goal is to help students see in a more critical way what the world's needs are and how they might be able to respond to those needs. So it's when the student leaves the year, hopefully the questions, as Justin was talking about, hopefully the questions don't leave. Hopefully the questions stay and tug and gnaw a little bit. And so that when they go out in the world, they can address and redress the various injustices and sufferings of the world. I mean, in some ways, it's like, try to see the suffering, and how can you as a human being try to address and alleviate the suffering, both at a personal level, but also at a structural and social level. How do we love each other in some ways better in the world?
One of the things I notice with students is seeing that suffering can be the beginning of transformation. And Shantari, it's amazing to me every year, by the end of the year, how many of my students have told me that they've had impactful conversations with you, because I know how many people are in the Pulse program, and I don't know how you manage to have such rich and deep conversations with so many of our students. So I think you see the growth of our students in a special way, because you see them across every class and every community partner. So if you could, and I know this is a hard question, if you could think about what the components of student growth are at Boston College, what would they be?
So when I was thinking about how to answer this question, I thought to myself, okay, I have to keep in mind that, with 400 plus students a year, everyone's coming from a different place. And so there's no way for me to think about specific key ingredients. There's no litmus test for students to come into Pulse. Everyone's coming in it, with a different sense of social justice, and their own experience. But as I thought about it a little bit more, and I reflected on my own work with students separate from being in this role, one thing I thought that kept coming up for me was patience. It's something that we all need, that oftentimes we all lack, and I'm no exception to that. We want things to hurry up and kind of get going. We want the change to happen in front of us. It's just like, why isn't this happening? And in Pulse, just like I think with many things in life, you just have to wait. And that can be a difficult process in today's world when we've become used to things that are instantaneous. The internet, now with things that are Zoom, you don't have to travel to go see someone anymore. You can get to see them on a screen. So everything is instantaneous. And in patience, you get to almost see the growth that you're looking for. It's happening in front of you, and it allows you the opportunity to see it. So that would be one very important ingredient. Something else that I thought a lot about was not giving too much importance to the big, huge aha moments. In every moment of your building a relationship with someone or in just being, there's incidental learning happening at that very moment. You know, when you're boiling water, you can't see the bubbles, you can't see it boiling, you know, but there's conduction, heat conduction is happening at that moment. And that's what it is. It's like the heat conduction that's happening until the end of the year. You know, you just have to wait and kind of let it cook a little bit. But I would also want to emphasize a little bit that there's the formal curriculum that's really important in the classroom. And it's just as important as the informal and the hidden curriculum that's happening in those incidental moments of learning. You know, when you're hanging out in the milieu at Shepherd House and, you know, you're chatting with your supervisor or the case managers and all of those things. So those are, I think, some really key ingredients to success: patience, curiosity, and waiting. You just sometimes just have to wait, you know, until the end. The most fruitful conversations might be the person that has ignored you for 2 semesters, and then the last week that you're finishing your service looks at you and says, I think I'm going to miss you when you're gone. And that might be the most successful, most amazing thing, you know, for you. But we sometimes, you know, put emphasis on the great shiny moments and not enough on the little things that are happening. I would also want to say that I myself had very, very influential teachers who taught me this exact same thing in my moments of extreme impatience when I said, you know, why isn't change happening? And it was, you just have to wait. You just have to wait. And that came from all spheres in my life, whether it was art, music, you know, working in case management. It was always just, you have to be patient and it'll come to you.
I can see why that is a very helpful thing to hear for students and probably for faculty and staff as well. My next question is for Justin and Nimsu. I think I'll start with Nimsu. And it's the same question for both of you, but I think Pulse is unique for a lot of reasons. But one thing it's unique for in the service learning field is its academic rigor. And so it brings many good books into the hands of students. Could you name a Pulse book that you would like to recommend to others, and then describe how it influenced your view of service? Nimsu first, and then Justin.
That's such a good question, and there's so many to choose from, I think. I think for me, one book that I will forever cherish from my Pulse experience is Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson, and I've had the opportunity to read it twice, one for my Pulse core class and one for my elective class with other council members. And I think in reading it that very first time, it just opened my eyes in a way that I never expected to the roots of the social injustices that existed in our world. And I don't think I would have had the opportunity to really explore had I not read it. And then the second time I read it was the fall of this past year, right before Bryan Stevenson came to campus. And knowing the stories that he'd written about in that book, I was able to really adopt a new lens and kind of be able to see the intersectionality between each story. And when he came to campus and talked about getting proximate to each other, getting proximate to the people that you serve, I think it really helped me kind of understand my role as an individual in this world. And like Megan said before, the title of Pulse really is person and social responsibility. And so as a person, how am I responsible for my actions? And what can I do as an individual? But then also, how can I lend to that social responsibility as a member of a much larger whole, as a member of a much larger group?
Yeah, I echo Nimsu on that. I love Just Mercy. The movie is amazing, and I have a huge admiration for Bryan Stevenson. Anybody who's close to me knows that. But I would say, and this isn't necessarily a book, but the person of Martin Luther King. I read him in my Pulse core, and I think Martin Luther King is very much misunderstood in a lot of ways, and I don't think it's really known how radical King became later in his life, and that was really transformative for me to see the way in which King was taking the dignity of people that he saw in everyone, that was stitched in everyone, and made really profound social implications out of that. And so I would definitely recommend to anyone who has not read some of King's later works, like some later sermons like Beyond Vietnam, The Other America. Those are Where Do We Go From Here? Those are incredible, honestly astonishing pieces.
I have a question for Megan, and I just want to admit that I'm not sure how I would answer this question as a fellow Pulse instructor, but I'm going to ask a related question, which is there a book that you particularly love to teach, or that has made an impact on you from teaching it? It doesn't have to be your favorite.
I have been teaching since I started teaching in Pulse, David Shipler's The Working Poor, and it has had 2 or 3 editions since then. And I think it came out in 2005, and I've been teaching it since 2006. And the reason Shipler is a journalist, and what he does, the full title of the book is The Invisible Poor, Invisible, The Working Poor, Invisible in America. And what he's really doing as a journalist is just following people's, the experiences of the working poor. And he's not trying to sort of romanticize or denigrate. What he's doing is I think, respectfully writing about individuals and their particular struggles. And what the stories do, and the way he presents them, is really introduce for students that sometimes people are suffering or experiencing various forms of repression. Sometimes they've made bad decisions, absolutely, and he doesn't let people off the hook. And sometimes there are structures that really make it impossible for someone to, quote unquote, get ahead. So he doesn't romanticize, he doesn't denigrate. He's really telling stories about people and showing their humanity, and how sometimes they make good decisions and bad decisions as individuals, and how those decisions are really often impacted and created by the situations in which they find themselves. He gets into a little philosophy, a little theology. So as a professor, it opens the door for me at that point to introduce some background information that I think is helpful for students to have. But it's a nice way to really introduce students to some of the topics in Pulse.
Favorite of mine as well.
Mm-hmm.
Justin, I have a question for you. You seem very involved in Pulse and have been since you arrived at BC. And sometimes I think Boston College has its own language because of our distinctive nature. I want to know, how do you describe Pulse and your involvement in it to your friends from home who are not at Boston College? What words do you use to kind of say, this is where I'm spending a lot of my time doing?
I think a lot of times I am honestly in a loss for words to describe it to them, but I just, it's really impossible and hard to put words to something so transformative that has happened to oneself, and to express that in a way that doesn't seem actually trite. But I think I describe it really as just a time and a time in my life when I was able to develop community with these kids in service that I could have never really imagined myself ever being in community with. And just the joy that I experienced, and the heartbreak, really, and the tears and the longing and the missing were really indescribable. And it's the Uno games and the making peanut butter sandwiches for dinner and one time I was playing basketball with one of the kids, and we were laughing so hard that one of the kids actually threw up. It's like those moments are how do you express that, right? But I think I can communicate a lot with just the joy that I exude whenever I tell these stories. And so I think that speaks for itself.
Nimsu, you said, or I'm sorry, Shantari, you talked about the role of patience. And I wanted to ask Nimsu, and I've seen this with my students. I've seen some students where they're kind of they're gobsmacked by the class immediately, and some students, it takes a long time for them to be impacted. At what point in your Pulse journey did you realize that this course was going to be transformative to you? Did it kind of sneak up on you? Was it from day one?
That's a really interesting question. I think I wouldn't say there was one exact moment in time. I think the entire course through the duration of it was transformative, and it still is transformative for me today, participating in Pulse electives and speaking to students. A little bit of background, I guess. For me, I come from a very suburban neighborhood in California, and so as a first-year student taking Pulse and participating in service where I ventured out into Boston neighborhoods on weekend mornings, I was getting used to college as a whole, but also very much getting accustomed and exploring what Boston was like and what an urban city was like. And for me, I think first and foremost, it was learning the environment, learning more about the environment and what place Boston College sat, and as well as how social injustices in Boston look, or what they look like as compared to what I normally saw in California. And so I think Professor Troxler, to maybe answer your question, it slowly snuck up on me a little bit. I think in the readings, again, I had no philosophy and no theology background. So in the readings, I was like, okay, so this is what they mean when they're talking about Aristotle and Plato. And seeing that applied to service, and I think understanding service in a very different lens than what I was used to back home, that was what transformed it all for me, is that this new lens adopted or developed throughout the year and is continuing to develop as for the foreseeable future.
I want to jump into the Q&A, the questions from the audience. And the first one here that I'd like to direct towards Shantari is a question from Marianne Hinsdale, professor in the theology department. She says, in my advising discussions with first-year students, I've always found a reluctance to take Pulse because of the impression that the service component would take too much of their time and result in poor academic performance. What might you say to students who hesitate to take Pulse because they're concerned about the time commitment with service work? And she adds a little aside at the end. She says, in my undergraduate theology seminars, I can always tell the Pulse students. So Shantari, how do you answer that question from Marianne Hinsdale?
I really like that she says that she can recognize the Pulse students. So that's great. So the question is, it's not so uncommon. That's true. A lot of times on the surface, students listen to that and they go, I have to do all this class and this reading and 12 hours. And I just don't know, but like all of these things, and I have to go off camp. The first thing I would say is stop for a second. Let's start again. It's time management. It's just like with anything that takes time getting used to. You spend some time figuring out where to get the supports. I mean, the Pulse office is really good at having a core group of student leaders be able to help through with that process. But we've had many, many students with complicated schedules and all different kinds of majors and minors and double majors and triple minors be able to take Pulse, and it works. It definitely works. Are there students that have very unique schedules that make it challenging but not impossible? Sure. But, sometimes when you put a schedule down onto paper, things seem a little bit easier. So I would say that is also definitely a trick, is let's sit down and put it on paper and see how things work out. But time management, it's always a good skill. Always a good skill.
Our next question is from Marina McCoy from the philosophy department, and she asks Nimsu and then Justin. One of the features of the Pulse classroom is that students are serving at different community partners, and often also from different states, countries, or different personal backgrounds. In what way did you experience the differences between yourself and others affect your educational experience in Pulse? So let me repeat that because I didn't phrase it very well. In what ways did you experience the differences between yourself and others affect your educational experiences in Pulse?
Like I mentioned before, I think I came in with a unique background as a first-year student in Pulse, having done community service in a very different lens than what service is in Pulse is like. In particular, I think being in a group of such diverse students with such a variety of backgrounds and knowledge and whole span of service experiences, I was able to not only learn from my personal experience, but able to learn from my peers and hearing about how their own experiences with service at home compared to that of service at other partners. And so for me, I think having served at a community center, I really enjoyed hearing from students like who served at other partners, like Justin had mentioned about his, students who served at other community partners that were at community centers or after school programs, and really learning about how social injustices and social justice was really enacted and portrayed in those lenses. And I think as a whole, learning from them, we were able to really communicate and talk about the kind of actionable responses that we were able to play out into this world.
And I think too, we each approach the Pulse experience from our own situations, from our own upbringings, from our own educational experience, from our own assumptions and underlying frameworks that we see the world. So I think in that way, and also really how we find ourselves and experience ourselves within structures of injustice, really shape how we see them, and more importantly, what we can't see. And so in that way, the education experience, I think, is really in the dialogical sense of what it is to be able to share our perspectives. It's a real space of listening that is quite incredible, I think, to be able to be a part of. But I think in service specifically, the differences between myself and those that I served with, I think, were especially pronounced because I served with kids who experienced trauma, and to experience trauma, I think one of the things I came to see was that really it has an impact on kids, especially that young, that is impossible to describe, and really the enormity of it is unfathomable, I think. But at the same time, really that disparity, I think, of experience actually doesn't dismiss the fact that there really are things that both of us seek, and that the love that we both long for, and the community that we both long for, and the hope for community and for friendship are shared, even amidst seemingly so disparate experiences. And so I think that really shaped my educational experience, and really seeing and experiencing in my own heart really the connectedness really between those that I served and myself, that I would have never seen had it not been for Pulse. And through that connectedness, how one perceives the world is greatly changed.
There's actually a question from a former Pulse Council member talking a little bit about interconnectedness. And so, Megan, I want you to take this one. Elizabeth Riley asks, Pulse works for us to see that humanness is an understanding of our interwoven collective responsibility. Conversations of justice are particularly challenging and can feel like those who disagree with are not seeing our interconnectedness. How can we continue to call others to see that there is not other, only us?
That's a great question. Hi, Elizabeth. So I'm going to quote that person who's really important for Christianity, and that's Jesus. And Jesus says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, not do to others as they have done to you. And so I think in many ways, the work of social justice is actually a really deep spiritual discipline, because in the ways we interact with people and sort of how we conduct ourselves, often in face of injustice, has to draw from the deepest depths of whatever source of groundedness that we have, so that our reactions to people and to situations are not reactive. So it's not about not addressing issues of social injustice, and it's not necessarily about being nice or not nice. It's about trying to address the problem as a problem, and not necessarily be violent in words or in emotions with others. And no one's going to get convinced of something other by clobbering them over the head. That's not going to work. So in some ways, the work of social injustice is very much about trying to demonstrate or model, I believe, is about trying to demonstrate or model some of the desired outcomes. And so keep a focus on the goal or the good, and maybe someone along the way will experience the sort of dual prongs of penitence and conversion. Because social justice work isn't just about what's going on out in the world. It's really very much about what goes on inside of us. And so one of the things I talk about with my own students is for them to try to think about the things that they're afraid of in the world or in their own lives, and how their fears may then end up creating unintended sort of social injustices in their own lives, or the way they may perpetuate them. Because what happens in the world is so deeply connected to what's happening in our own interior selves.
All right, this is a question from Joan Jungman, who graduated from Boston College in 2018. And I'll ask this to you, Nimsu. How has your Pulse Council experience challenged you to grow? So we've been talking a lot about your experience as a Pulse student, but how have you continued that as a Pulse Council member?
I think as a Pulse Council member, one of the greatest parts of being on council is that you're continuing to have these conversations of social injustice, about social justice and social justice with other members who are just as passionate, if not more passionate than you, about the topics that you discussed previously in the core course, and who have a variety of experiences from the partners that they served. One of the particular responsibilities as a council member is that you help to really be the student liaisons between the Pulse program, the Pulse students, and then the supervisors of various partners. And so I think for me, having come from Pulse service at a community center, and then serving as a council member this past year to that community center, as well as an agency that works primarily with the HIV and AIDS community in Boston, I was really prompted to explore a lot more social injustices that I may not have had the opportunity to explore as a core member, because I served at one partner. In doing that too, I was able to really open and foster a lot of conversations, and really partake in a lot of conversations that I had with my students as well, that allowed me to see how they were experiencing Pulse in a way that I might have, or in a different way. And so I think in terms of challenging myself to grow, it was, in what ways can I continue to explore these questions and have these conversations in ways that I haven't before.
Shantari, here's one from an alum, Sarah Gately. She asks, I'm curious, how have you seen alumni meaningfully carry Pulse forward into their post-grad lives? I had Professor Troxel for Pulse, which was my favorite class at BC. And I went on to work as a staff member at my Pulse placement, St. Mary's Home, my junior and senior year.
So the answer to that is actually, well, I mean, it's simple and it's not so simple. Many of our partnerships, our Pulse partnerships, have someone who did Pulse, X number of years ago, and they're working at a nonprofit, and they start the relationship. I think for me, that's a really concrete way that I see how some Pulse alum have taken that experience and gone forward. At the same time, though, there's also students who have gone through Pulse who are continuing in their social justice education journey, who may have served, let's just say, for example, at an elementary school and come away from that thinking, I learned a lot. I'm never going to be a teacher. But boy, this really changed my perception of the amount of work that teachers put into a classroom. And while I may not go into education or anything even remotely related to that, I'm going to continue making mentorship with youth some part of my life. So you see that in different ways. And sometimes those changes can happen 10, 15 years out. And sometimes, the person may actually make concrete decisions to work at a location that's very closely connected to their Pulse experience, their Pulse journey. So I think those are some of the ways. I always really enjoy staying in touch with alum, and I'm hoping to be able to connect to more as time goes on, because I think that those journeys are really invaluable to know.
And if I might put a plug in on our website, there's an opportunity for Pulse alums to sort of let us know who you are and to be in touch with the office. So just go to bc.edu/Pulse, and there will be a link there that you can fill out, so you can tell us a little bit about you.
Hugs to Sarah. The next question is from Takahito Kamada, a professor at Sophia University in Tokyo, Japan. And I'm going to direct this question to you, Megan. How do you teach or learn the significance of face-to-face engagement or community engagement on service learning through the online platform under the influence of COVID-19?
So this is an excellent question, and something that the Pulse faculty and staff have been wrestling with since March. So Pulse is service learning, and so there's always service to be done, and what the service will look like will differ from year to year. We made a decision to go fully remote with service for this coming year, and there are a variety of reasons for that decision. This is the reality of the world in which we live. And as Shantari said earlier, social justice or social injustice didn't go on hiatus because because physical distancing is required. We can still do some kind of social connection even if we're physically distant. And so we've been working to try to create remote partnerships for service for the year so that students will still have direct experience with some of our community partners. Will it be quote unquote Pulse as normal? Absolutely not, but we are not living in quote unquote normal times. So given the circumstances, this is what getting proximate will look like. And so part of it is about being flexible and about changing expectations. And I'm very hopeful that that if students are willing to learn with what they are given access to, that there will still be learning that happens. The service alone, Shantari mentioned it earlier, the two pieces, the class and the service go absolutely hand in hand. So the service is interpreted through the texts, and likewise the texts are interpreted through the service. So we will do the best we can with the situation that's presented, that we're all in, actually.
Thank you, Megan. And I have just one final question before we wrap up tonight, and it's for Nimsu and Justin. You are both student leaders in Pulse at a very auspicious time at the 50th anniversary. Was there anything that you noticed in the celebrations of 50 years of Pulse that stood out to you as something special? Why don't Justin go first, and then Nimsu will finish it off for us.
I really think the evolution of what Pulse has become is really fascinating in the respect that a lot of what we're doing this year, what Megan was kind of hinting at, is that in the beginning there was a lot of opportunity. I think Pulse was initially called the Social Action Agency, am I right? And so it was really a lot of times focused on more internships or that sort of service that was striving to really kind of make change substantively. But as Pulse, I think, grew, it was interesting to me that a lot of service transitioned to especially direct service. And a lot of what Pulse does is kind of unworking the notions of service that students bring in from high school. And that is part of the work of teaching. But it's interesting this year that we're kind of reframing again what service is, but specific to this time, where even though we're not going in and serving food at Pine Street Inn, there's a way in which working for doing grant research and grant writing for Pine Street Inn is service at the heart, but it might look different, but it's still serving the mission of the organization, and in that way, good and helpful.
I think Justin said it beautifully. I think Pulse has persevered in the face of adversity many times, and I think this pandemic is no exception. While, like Shantari and Megan said, service is going virtual, social injustice has not halted during this pandemic. And in that, we are still trying our best to maintain relationships with our partners, because our partners have continued to serve the populations that they do. And in doing so, we want to continue to serve our partners. And so we're excited for this upcoming year and continuing to persevere in the face of adversity of COVID-19, the racial injustices that are happening, and anything else that will come our way in 2020.
Yeah. I can't believe the hour's up, but I want to thank all of our guests. I want to thank Bert, and I want to give a preview for the final episode of the show at 6. It's going to be called Bringing It Home, and it features David Quigley, the Provost and Dean of Faculties and Professor of History, and also Joy Moore, Class of '81, and Vice President for Student Affairs. It's on August 14th from 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock p.m. You do need to register for the segment. As you know, registration is very brief, but each segment has a different webinar link. So please check out our webpage, bc.edu/show@6, and see the next segments. While you are there, check out our archives, where all of our previous segments are posted. Be well and be safe. Good night from Boston College.